The late autumn wind howled through the narrow valley like a mournful spirit, whipping Margaret Clark's shawl around her shoulders as she gazed across the rugged landscape. 3 months had passed since the railroad surveyors first appeared on their land, marking their intentions with wooden stakes topped with fluttering red ribbons. Her husband Henry hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since that day, his weathered face growing more distant with each passing sunset. Their ranch sat nestled against the foothills outside Deadwood, caught between the advancing iron rails and the ancient hunting grounds of the Cheyenne. The sound of hammering echoed through the crisp mountain air as Margaret made her way down to check on their cattle. Railroad crews were already laying track less than 5 miles away, their progress marked by pillars of smoke rising from work camps scattered across the valley floor. The Clark Ranch had been their dream. 20 years of backbreaking work transforming wild land into a profitable cattle operation. Now progress threatened to slice their property in two, all in the name of connecting Deadwood's gold mines to markets back east. Henry spent his days in town meeting with other ranchers, trying to fight the railroad's land claims through legal channels. But Margaret knew it was likely futile. The mining companies held too much influence, and the territory governor had already granted the railroad right-of-way through their valley. Still, she admired her husband's quiet determination, even as she watched helplessly while worry etched deeper lines around his eyes. Their teenage son Daniel helped where he could, but at 16 he was more interested in the excitement the railroad brought than preserving their way of life. The cattle were uneasy lately, spooked by the constant dynamite blasts as crews carved the railbed through the mountainside. Margaret counted heads carefully, noting several missing from the herd. Following their tracks, she urged her horse up a narrow draw where the animals sometimes grazed. The path wound through towering granite walls streaked with ore seams that had drawn prospectors to these hills decades ago. Now those same mineral riches were driving the railroad's relentless advance. A strange sound caught her attention, something between a grunt and a moan coming from a boggy area ahead. Margaret dismounted carefully, leading her horse forward until she spotted the source. A man was trapped in a patch of quicksand, already sunken to his chest. His face was painted with traditional Cheyenne warrior markings, though age had carved deep lines across his features. Their eyes met, and Margaret saw neither fear nor hatred in his steady gaze, only calm acceptance of his fate. Without hesitation, Margaret quickly gathered fallen branches and began laying them across the treacherous ground. The warrior watched silently as she worked her way closer, finally extending a sturdy branch within his reach. It took nearly an hour of careful maneuvering, but eventually she helped pull him free of the deadly mire. He said nothing as he recovered his strength, but his eyes never left her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and carried the weight of authority. "I am Thunder Horse, warchief of the Northern Cheyenne," he said in careful English. "You showed great courage helping one who many would call enemy. The spirits of wind and storm have long been allies to my people. I will teach you their ways, so you may call upon their power in times of need." Margaret started to protest, but something in his bearing told her this was no idle talk. That evening marked the beginning of her training in arts few white people had ever witnessed. Over the following weeks, Thunder Horse taught Margaret the ancient songs and gestures that could summon the wind spirits. She learned to feel their presence in every breeze, to understand their moods and movements. The warrior spoke of how his people had long served as guardians of these sacred powers, maintaining harmony between the physical and spirit worlds. But now, with their way of life being destroyed, perhaps it was time for new guardians to arise. The lessons took place in secret, usually at dawn before the rest of the ranch stirred to life. Margaret found herself transformed by the experience, developing a deep connection to the invisible forces that shaped the natural world. She came to understand that the wind spirits were neither good nor evil. They simply were, like forces of nature given consciousness and will. Their power could protect or destroy, depending on how they were approached and guided. Thunder Horse explained that the spirits had chosen her, recognizing a pure heart that sought harmony rather than dominance. He taught her their true names, the ancient songs that could calm their fury or rouse them to action. Margaret absorbed it all, sensing that this knowledge was being entrusted to her for a greater purpose. The railroad's advance continued unabated, but she felt a new sense of peace, knowing she now had the means to protect what mattered most. The first test of Margaret's newfound abilities came sooner than expected. As spring gave way to summer, Survey crews from the railroad company began appearing more frequently in the valleys below the ranch, marking routes through the pristine wilderness. Their presence stirred an uneasiness in the wind that Margaret could now sense, a restless whisper that made the aspens shiver even on still days. One afternoon, while Henry was in Cheyenne negotiating cattle prices, Margaret noticed a group of men setting survey stakes uncomfortably close to the sacred spring where Thunderhorse had first taught her the wind spirit songs. The spring's waters held special significance for the Cheyenne people, and she knew she couldn't allow it to be desecrated by the railroad's iron path. Drawing upon her training, she began to softly hum one of the ancient melodies. The response was immediate but subtle, just as Thunderhorse had taught her. A gentle breeze arose, carrying with it the sweet scent of sage and wild mint. The surveyors paused in their work, glancing uneasily at the darkening sky above. Margaret wove her voice through the growing wind, shaping it with the words Thunderhorse had shared. The breeze strengthened, whipping dust and debris into miniature cyclones that danced around the workers. Frank, the survey crew's leader, squinted through the rising gale at his fluttering maps. "Something ain't right about this spot, boys," he called out, struggling to keep his hat from flying away. "Weather's turned peculiar. Maybe we ought to consider that alternate route through Deadwood instead." His men nodded eagerly, already gathering their equipment as the wind continued to intensify. Within minutes, they had packed up and begun their retreat. Margaret watched them go, maintaining the song until they were well out of sight. As she let the melody fade, the wind gentled back to a whisper. She felt drained but satisfied, understanding now why Thunderhorse had stressed the importance of using the spirit's power with restraint and respect. This had been a warning only, a reminder that some places deserve to remain untouched by progress. Word of the strange occurrence spread quickly through the nearby mining camps. Charlie, an old prospector who'd been working the streams since before the railroad surveys began, spoke in hushed tones at the trading post about mysterious winds that seemed to guard certain territories. Such tales might have been dismissed as mere superstition, but others had begun to notice similar phenomena when survey crews ventured too close to sacred grounds. The railroad's directors in their distant offices remained undeterred, but their local operations grew more cautious. Robert, the regional superintendent, found himself dealing with increasingly nervous work crews. Men who'd spent their lives in the mountains spoke of unnatural weather patterns, of winds that seemed to carry whispered warnings in languages they didn't understand. Some refused to work certain areas altogether, claiming the very air felt wrong. Margaret kept her secret closely guarded, sharing it only with Thunderhorse during his occasional visits. The old warchief nodded approvingly when she described how she'd turned back the survey crew, but his eyes held a shadow of concern. "The railroad men are like the buffalo," he said quietly. "When one path is blocked, they will seek another. We must be vigilant, and we must be wise in choosing our battles." His words proved prophetic. As summer waned, Margaret began hearing rumors of a new survey route being planned, one that would cut through the heart of the valley where the local Cheyenne gathered their medicinal herbs. The stakes were rising, and she knew that protecting that sacred space would require more than just a demonstration of wind power. She would need to find a way to make the railroad men understand what they were threatening to destroy before the spirits themselves decided to deliver a harsher message. The tension within her grew as she watched more survey crews arriving in the area, setting up camp in the mining town near El Paso Creek. They moved with greater determination now, their routes carefully planned to avoid the areas where previous crews had encountered mysterious difficulties. Margaret realized she would need to expand her understanding of the wind spirit's powers if she hoped to protect all that Thunderhorse had entrusted to her care. The autumn wind whistled through the narrow mountain passes as Margaret Anderson stood at the edge of her ranch, watching the railroad surveyors mark their path through the valley below. The gift of wind control bestowed by the Cheyenne warchief had grown stronger over the past weeks, though she kept it carefully hidden from her husband Henry. The spirits whispered to her of coming storms, both natural and human, as the Union Pacific crews pushed their iron rails ever closer to their land near Deadwood. Henry Anderson paced their cabin's porch, his weathered face creased with worry as he studied the survey stakes dotting their lower pasture. The railroad's land agent, Frank Taylor, had made increasingly aggressive offers for their property, knowing it provided the only viable route through the treacherous mountain pass. Margaret felt the wind spirit stir restlessly whenever Taylor approached. Sensing his hidden malice beneath the polite business facade, Daniel Clark, the local mining operator, had already sold his adjacent claims to the railroad, eager for the promised riches of easier ore transport. His decision had divided the community, with some ranchers and miners welcoming progress while others feared losing their way of life. Margaret watched him now, conferring with Taylor near the creek bed, their heads bent close in conspiratorial discussion. The gift of the winds had shown Margaret visions of what was to come. The scarred earth, the displaced wildlife, the changed patterns of rain and snow that would follow the railroad's arrival. But it had also revealed something darker. Taylor's secret dealings with hired guns from Dodge City brought in to pressure holdout landowners through increasingly violent means. The spirits had guided her to overhear their whispered plans in the saloon. Rachel Moore, who ran the general store with her husband Charlie, had noticed the strange new men in town as well. She confided in Margaret during her weekly supply run about the threatening atmosphere that now permeated their once peaceful community. The railroad's influence had already begun changing Deadwood, bringing an influx of rough characters and desperate fortune-seekers drawn by rumors of coming prosperity. As twilight approached, Margaret felt an otherworldly stirring in the air, the wind spirits warning her of approaching danger. Through their ethereal connection, she sensed riders approaching from the north, their intentions hostile. Taylor had grown tired of negotiations and was ready to escalate matters. She knew she would have to reveal her powers to Henry soon. Though she dreaded his reaction to learning his wife commanded supernatural forces, the mining operations had already transformed the mountainside into a maze of tunnels and tailings, the scars visible from miles away. Daniel Clark's decision to sell had opened the floodgates, providing the railroad with a foothold in the region. Now Margaret watched as more surveyors appeared each day, measuring and marking, their presence a constant reminder of the changing times. The wind spirits mourned the wounded earth, their laments carrying through the evening air. A rider appeared on the ridge, Robert Walker, their nearest neighbor, coming to warn them about armed men gathering in town. The spirits had already shown Margaret their faces, hardened gunmen, hired by Taylor, waiting in the shadows of Deadwood saloons. She could feel their dark intentions carried on the wind, along with the acrid smell of coal smoke from the mining operations that now ran day and night. That evening, as Henry cleaned his rifle and watched the setting sun paint the hills in blood-red hues, Margaret struggled with her secret. The wind spirits urged her to act, showing her visions of violence to come. But revealing her powers meant risking everything: her marriage, her place in the community, perhaps even her life. The gift that had seemed a blessing now felt like a terrible burden as she watched her husband prepare for the coming conflict. Susan Taylor, the land agent's wife, visited under the pretense of neighborly concern. But Margaret felt the winds shift treacherously around the woman, carrying whispers of deception. Susan's apparently friendly warnings about accepting inevitable progress barely masked the threat beneath. Margaret maintained her calm demeanor while the wind spirits swirled agitatedly, sensing the true purpose behind Susan's false smiles. The railroad's influence had already begun to poison relationships throughout the community. Longtime friends now viewed each other with suspicion, taking sides in the growing conflict. Martha Clark, Daniel's wife, no longer spoke to Margaret at church, ashamed of her husband's role in enabling the railroad's advance. The spirits showed Margaret how these fractures would only deepen as pressure from the railroad increased. In the growing darkness, Margaret stood alone on the porch, feeling the power of the winds gathering around her. The spirits warned of riders approaching from multiple directions, Taylor's men making their move. She knew the time for secrecy had passed. Whether Henry accepted her power or not, she would have to use it tonight to protect their home and land. The wind began to rise, responding to her will as she prepared to face what was coming. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm clouds were visible in the star-filled sky. The wind spirits were gathering their strength, ready to help Margaret defend against the approaching threat. She could feel Henry watching her from inside the cabin, sensing something different in his wife's stance as she faced the darkness. The time had come to reveal everything: her rescue of the warchief, the gifts she'd been given, and the true nature of the forces gathering against them. The first riders appeared as dark silhouettes against the starlit horizon, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that glowed silver in the moonlight. Margaret counted 6 men approaching from the east, led by Frank Taylor himself, his signature white hat visible even at this distance. The wind spirits whispered their movements to her, carrying fragments of hushed conversations about demolition charges and railroad stakes. Henry emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand, his weathered face tight with concern. "Margaret, get inside," he said firmly. But she remained standing, her skirts beginning to billow in the unnaturally strengthening wind. The approaching men didn't yet realize that the sudden gusts working against them were no ordinary mountain weather. "There's more coming from the south," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made Henry pause. "Daniel's group, another 8 men." She turned to face her husband, seeing the questions in his eyes. "I need to tell you something, and there isn't much time. That day last spring when I went missing during the storm, I wasn't lost. I found someone, saved someone. A Cheyenne warchief." The wind picked up dramatically, swirling dust devils around the cabin's perimeter as Taylor's men drew closer. Henry's grip tightened on his rifle as Margaret continued, her words rushing out now. "He gave me something in return, a gift, a power over the wind spirits. I know it sounds impossible, but you're about to see for yourself." From the South Valley came the sound of wagon wheels, heavy equipment being transported under cover of darkness. The railroad men had clearly planned this assault carefully, choosing a moonlit night to move their demolition supplies into position. Margaret closed her eyes, reaching out to the spirits that had become her allies, feeling their eager response to her call. Suddenly, a massive gust roared down from the mountain peaks, so powerful it nearly knocked the approaching riders from their horses. Equipment crashed, and men shouted as their carefully planned approach dissolved into chaos. Margaret raised her hands, directing the winds with subtle gestures that seemed to flow from some ancient memory. Henry watched in astonishment as his wife commanded the elements themselves, her hair whipping wildly around her face. The spirits responded to her will, creating a whirlwind that encircled their property like a protective wall. Through the swirling barrier, they could see Taylor's men struggling to maintain control of their panicked horses. "The mining claims were never about gold," Margaret shouted over the wind's roar. "They're using them as an excuse to seize the land for the railroad. Taylor's been working with them all along." She turned to Henry, her eyes bright with determination. "I couldn't tell you about the power before. I wasn't sure how. But we need it now. We need everything we have to stop them." The sound of splintering wood cut through the wind's howl as several fence posts went flying, caught in the supernatural storm. Taylor's voice carried across the chaos, ordering his men to push forward despite the impossible weather. But the spirits responded to Margaret's will, intensifying their assault, creating a barrier of wind and debris that no horse would willingly cross. In the midst of the maelstrom, Henry stepped closer to his wife, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Whatever questions or doubts he had could wait. Right now, he could see they were fighting for more than just their land. This was about standing against the crushing force of progress that threatened to destroy everything they'd built, everything they believed in. The night stretched on, a standoff between human greed and ancient power, with Margaret standing firm at the center of it all. The wind spirits danced to her command, protecting what was theirs, while in the distance the frustrated shouts of Taylor's men gradually gave way to retreat. But both Margaret and Henry knew this was only the beginning. The railroad wouldn't give up so easily, and their quiet life had changed forever. As the winds gradually calmed, Margaret sagged slightly, tired but unbowed. "There's more to tell you," she said to Henry, "about the warchief, about why he chose me. But first, we need to prepare. They'll be back, and next time they'll bring more than just men and dynamite. They'll bring everything they have." The wind howled through Deadwood's canyons as Margaret Clark stood atop Thunder Ridge, her eyes fixed on the approaching storm. The Cheyenne warchief's gift of wind command had grown stronger over the past months, and she could feel the spirits stirring within the darkening clouds. Below, the railroad crews continued their relentless advance through sacred tribal lands, their dynamite blasts echoing off the mountainsides as they carved their iron path through ancient hunting grounds. Frank Anderson, the railroad baron, paced anxiously in his private rail car at the mountain's base. The recent sabotage of his construction sites had cost him dearly, and he suspected the local Cheyenne were behind it. What he didn't know was that Margaret, wife of rancher Henry Clark, had been secretly using her newfound powers to protect both the tribe's ancestral lands and the delicate balance of the frontier that was rapidly disappearing. Deep in a hidden valley, Charlie Moore, the aging medicine man who had become Margaret's mentor in the ways of spirit magic, prepared the sacred herbs for the ritual that would determine the fate of the mountains. The railroad's path threatened not just the land, but the very essence of the wind spirits themselves. Their ancient paths through the canyons would be forever altered by the Iron Horse's passage. Robert Taylor, the railroad's chief engineer, studied his maps with growing concern. Every time they attempted to blast through certain ridges, mysterious windstorms would appear, scattering their equipment and forcing delays. He had lost 3 good men to unexplained accidents, and the workers were growing increasingly superstitious. Some claimed to see ghostly figures riding the wind during these storms. In her cabin near the disputed territory, Laura Walker tended to Daniel Moore, Charlie's son, who had been wounded in a skirmish with railroad guards. The young warrior had been leading raids to protect sacred burial grounds, but Margaret's wind powers had kept anyone from being killed. Laura understood the delicate balance her friend Margaret was trying to maintain between the two worlds. The confrontation that had been brewing finally erupted when Frank Anderson ordered his men to blast through Spirit Rock. The towering formation that Charlie had warned was a crucial anchor point for the wind spirits. Margaret felt the disturbance before the dynamite was even lit, the spirits crying out in her mind with such force that she nearly fell from her horse. Racing against time, Margaret channeled the wind spirits as she had never done before, creating a massive dust storm that engulfed the railroad camp. Workers fled in terror as their equipment was lifted into the air, tools and supplies scattered across the mountainside. But Frank Anderson, driven by ambition and spite, refused to abandon his position at the base of Spirit Rock. The true test of Margaret's powers came when she confronted Frank Anderson directly, the wind whipping her skirts and hair as she stood before him. The railroad baron raised his pistol, but before he could fire, the wind spirits manifested visibly for the first time. Translucent forms of ancient warriors riding the currents of air, their presence undeniable even to the most hardened skeptic. Charlie Moore arrived with a delegation of Cheyenne elders, their voices raised in ancient songs that seemed to strengthen the wind spirit's manifestation. Frank Anderson's men, witnessing the supernatural display, began abandoning their posts. Robert Taylor, the engineer, dropped his maps and fell to his knees, finally understanding the true power that dwelt in these mountains. Henry Clark watched in awe as his wife commanded the elements, her connection to the spirit world revealing a strength he had never fully comprehended before. The Wind Warriors circled Spirit Rock, their ethereal forms creating a barrier that no mortal force could penetrate. Frank Anderson, his empire crumbling before forces he couldn't control, finally admitted defeat. But victory came with a price. The massive display of spirit power had taken its toll on Margaret, and she collapsed into Henry's arms as the winds began to settle. Charlie Moore hurried to her side, understanding that wielding such power could burn out a person's life force if not properly channeled. The fate of the mountains had been decided, but Margaret's journey was far from over. Daniel Moore, despite his injuries, organized the warriors to guard the railroad camp while negotiations began. Frank Anderson, shaken by what he had witnessed, agreed to reroute the railroad away from the sacred sites. Robert Taylor worked through the night to draft new plans that would respect the ancient paths of both the tribes and the wind spirits. In the aftermath, Laura Walker helped Margaret recover her strength, while the wind spirits settled into a new balance. The railroad would still come through these mountains, but now it would follow a path that honored the old ways while embracing the new. Margaret's unique position as bridge between two worlds had forged a solution that few could have imagined possible. The story of the Wind Warrior woman spread through the territory, growing with each telling. Some said she could summon storms with a whisper. Others claimed she could ride the wind itself. But Margaret Clark knew the truth was both simpler and more complex. She had been chosen to protect a balance that was essential to the survival of both her world and the ancient one that had chosen to trust her. As storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, Margaret stood at the edge of the newly surveyed railroad route, her hair whipping in the strengthening wind. The spirits were restless. They sensed what was coming. In the valley below, a massive work crew was advancing with their steel rails and wooden ties, the rhythmic pounding of hammers echoing off the cliff faces. But it wasn't the railroad that concerned her now. The spirits had warned her of something far more dangerous approaching. Laura Walker rode up beside her, worry etched across her weathered face. "The mining company sent telegrams to every hired gun between here and Deadwood," she said quietly. "Frank Miller's gathering an army to take back what he claims is his land, both the sacred sites and the silver deposits beneath them." Margaret nodded grimly, having already sensed the approaching conflict through her connection with the wind spirits. In the makeshift camp below, Robert Taylor paced anxiously among the survey stakes and construction materials. The railroad's new route would take longer to build and cost more, but he had stood by his word. Now, with Miller's threats looming, he faced pressure from his eastern investors to abandon the agreement and revert to the original plan. The fate of both the railroad and the sacred lands hung precariously in the balance. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying with it the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Margaret closed her eyes, communing with the spirits that had chosen her as their conduit. They showed her visions of dozens of armed men making their way through the mountain passes, led by Frank Miller himself. But they also revealed something else. Ancient burial caves deep within the mountain that could serve as sanctuary if things went wrong. Laura organized the local ranchers and miners who had come to support the new agreement, positioning them strategically among the rocky outcrops. These were men and women who had come to understand the importance of maintaining harmony between the old ways and the new. They would stand with Margaret, even against overwhelming odds. The wind spirits swirled around them, offering what protection they could. As the sun began to set, the first riders appeared on the ridgeline. Frank Miller sat tall in his saddle, his face twisted with greed and anger. Behind him, more than 50 hired guns spread out along the heights. "This ends tonight," he shouted down into the valley. "Either clear out now, or we'll bury you with those spirits you're so fond of." The wind carried his threats clearly to every ear. Margaret stepped forward, drawing on the power that had been gifted to her that day in the quicksand. The spirits responded, gathering around her like an invisible cloak. The wind began to howl through the rocks, creating an otherworldly chorus that made even the most hardened gunmen shift uneasily in their saddles. This was the moment that would determine not just the fate of the sacred lands, but the future of two worlds that had become inexorably intertwined. Robert Taylor watched in awe as dust devils began to form in the valley, dancing and weaving between the survey stakes. He had seen many things during his years building railroads across the West, but nothing like this. The power Margaret commanded was both beautiful and terrifying, a force of nature itself rising up to defend its ancient domain against those who would desecrate it for profit. Above them, storm clouds continued to gather, drawn by Margaret's connection to the wind spirits. Lightning flickered between the peaks, illuminating the faces of Miller's men in brief, stark flashes. The air crackled with tension and supernatural energy as two worlds prepared to clash on this mountain battlefield. The wind spirits had chosen their warrior, and through her, they would make their final stand. Margaret raised her arms, and the wind responded with a deafening roar that echoed through the mountain passes. The survey stakes began to vibrate, then tear free from the earth entirely, spinning through the air like deadly projectiles. Robert Taylor's men scattered, diving for cover behind boulders and fallen trees as the wooden stakes whistled past their heads. The railroad baron himself stood transfixed, his normally imperious expression replaced by one of naked fear. Thunder cracked overhead as dark clouds churned and merged, forming a vast vortex above the contested valley. The wind spirits Margaret had awakened were ancient and powerful, carrying the memories of countless generations who had walked these sacred lands. Their fury manifested in swirling columns of dust and debris that grew larger with each passing moment, threatening to become full-fledged tornadoes. "This is your last warning," Margaret called out, her voice carrying unnaturally across the din. The autumn winds howled through Deadwood's mountain passes as Margaret Anderson stood before the railroad tycoons, her newly acquired power over the wind spirits manifesting in subtle ways that made the businessmen shift uneasily in their seats. The meeting hall's wooden walls creaked under the supernatural pressure as she faced down Robert Clark, the Pacific Western Railroad's most ruthless negotiator. Her rescue of White Eagle, the Cheyenne warchief, had changed everything. Not just through the mystical gift he'd bestowed, but through the wisdom he'd shared about the land's true value. Charlie Moore, the mining company foreman, watched from the back of the room with undisguised contempt. He'd spent months trying to force Margaret to sell her late husband's land for the railroad's expansion, never suspecting she'd find allies among the very people his company had tried to drive away. The spirits that now answered to her call had revealed the rich veins of gold running beneath her property, far more valuable than the railroad's insulting offer. Laura Taylor, Margaret's closest friend since childhood, stood beside her at the negotiating table, carefully documenting every word exchanged. The railroad men had brought their usual stack of threatening legal documents, but this time, Margaret held something far more powerful: evidence of their illegal mining operations on Cheyenne tribal lands, gathered with the help of White Eagle's scouts and the wind spirits that now served as her eyes and ears across the territory. Daniel Walker, the town's aging sheriff, had initially dismissed Margaret's tales of mystical powers as the ravings of a widow, driven mad by grief. But after witnessing her command the wind to uncover a hidden cache of stolen gold the railroad had buried on contested land, he'd become her strongest advocate in the legal battle that followed. His weathered face showed grim satisfaction as Robert Clark's bluster slowly deflated under Margaret's unwavering gaze. Frank Anderson, Margaret's brother-in-law, had traveled all the way from Dodge City to stand with her in this final confrontation. He'd been skeptical of her alliance with the Cheyenne at first, but seeing how White Eagle's people had helped protect the land while teaching Margaret to harness her newfound abilities had transformed his understanding of what was truly at stake. The railroad's plan to cut through sacred burial grounds now seemed not just disrespectful, but dangerous. The wind spirits whispered ancient secrets in Margaret's ears as she laid out her terms. The railroad would have to reroute their expansion, avoiding both the tribal lands and the sacred mountains where the spirits dwelt. In exchange, she would grant them a narrow passage through the western edge of her property, but only if they signed a binding agreement to protect the ancient burial sites and share profits from any mining operations with the Cheyenne people. White Eagle himself appeared at the meeting hall's entrance, his presence commanding immediate attention. The railroad men's faces paled as a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the eerie sounds of ancestral voices. Margaret had learned that the spirit's power grew stronger when she acted in harmony with both the land's original guardians and her own conscience. This was about more than just protecting her property. It was about preserving a delicate balance between progress and tradition. Martha Clark, Robert's wife, shocked everyone by standing up from her seat among the railroad's supporters. She revealed that she too had witnessed the spirit's power firsthand and could no longer support her husband's destructive ambitions. The bonds between the women of the frontier, she declared, ran deeper than money or marriage. Her defection marked a turning point in the negotiations, as other wives of prominent businessmen began questioning their husbands' motives. The mining operations that had scarred the mountainsides began to take on a different character under the new agreement Margaret forced through. Charlie Moore found himself working alongside Cheyenne craftsmen, who understood how to extract gold without angering the spirits of the earth. The wind carried songs of healing through the valleys as old wounds between peoples slowly began to mend. Margaret's power grew not through dominance but through fostering understanding between former enemies. Susan Walker, the sheriff's daughter who had once dreamed of leaving Deadwood far behind, discovered a new appreciation for her homeland through Margaret's teachings. The wind spirits showed her visions of the territory's past and possible futures, helping her understand that progress didn't have to mean destruction. She began documenting the oral histories of both settlers and native peoples, creating a bridge between worlds that would outlast the railroad's iron tracks. As winter approached, Margaret stood on her porch watching the first snow dance on spirit winds. The railroad's revised route now wound through the territory like a river, respecting the natural flow of the land rather than cutting against it. White Eagle's people had begun teaching others their ways of living in harmony with the powerful forces that dwelled in the mountains. The wind carried messages between scattered communities, binding them together in ways the railroad's planners had never imagined. The transformation of Deadwood from a rough mining town into a place where different cultures could coexist peacefully became a model for other frontier settlements. Rachel Moore, Charlie's youngest daughter, grew up learning both the settlers' ways and Cheyenne wisdom, becoming a symbol of the new understanding that Margaret's unusual gift had helped create. The spirits that had once threatened to tear the community apart now served as its guardians, reminding everyone that the greatest power lay not in controlling the land, but in learning to live as part of it. As the seasons turned, Margaret's unique connection to the wind spirits brought unexpected changes to the mountain territories. The railroad company's engineers, once skeptical of indigenous wisdom, now regularly consulted with White Eagle's people before laying new track. They discovered that following the natural pathways revealed by the winds not only made construction easier, but also resulted in routes that better served both settlers and native communities. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking Deadwood. watching as dust devils danced through the streets below. The wind whispered tales of approaching winter storms and carried messages from distant camps. She had learned to interpret these ethereal communications with increasing precision, becoming a vital link between the various communities that now shared the land. Charlie, who had initially struggled to understand his wife's newfound abilities, had grown to appreciate the deeper wisdom they represented. The mining operations he oversaw now followed patterns suggested by the wind spirits, reducing accidents and increasing yields while minimizing damage to sacred sites. The success of this approach drew attention from mining companies as far away as Cheyenne, leading to a gradual shift in how resource extraction was conducted throughout the territory. Rachel Moore, now a young woman, had inherited her mother's sensitivity to the wind spirits, though in a different way. While Margaret commanded them, Rachel could see the patterns they created, reading the landscape like a living map. She became instrumental in helping survey teams plan new railroad spurs that connected isolated communities while preserving the delicate balance between progress and tradition. The transformation extended beyond the practical realm. In Deadwood's newly established school, children of both settlers and indigenous families learned together, sharing stories of their respective cultures. The wind spirits, once feared by many settlers, became regarded as protective forces, their presence acknowledged in the architecture of new buildings and the layout of streets. Frank, the former railroad baron who had once sought to dominate the land, made his peace with the new order. His company's profits had actually increased since adopting the wind-guided approach, though in ways he never could have predicted. The railroad now served as a bridge between cultures rather than a barrier, its roots following the ancient paths that the spirits had always known. During a particularly harsh winter, when blizzards threatened to isolate several communities, Margaret's connection to the wind spirits proved invaluable. She coordinated with White Eagle's people to establish safe corridors through the storms, allowing vital supplies to reach those in need. This cooperation saved many lives and further cemented the bonds between the different peoples of the territory. The mining town of Deadwood, once known for its lawlessness, developed into a unique frontier community where traditional knowledge and modern progress found common ground. The old saloon where Margaret had first met White Eagle was transformed into a meeting hall where tribal elders and town council members gathered to make decisions affecting the entire region. As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it new growth and possibilities, Margaret reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness in quicksand. The wind spirits had taught her that true power lay not in controlling nature, but in understanding one's place within it. This wisdom, passed down through generations of Cheyenne people, had found new expression in the changing West. The story of the rancher's wife who could command the winds became part of the region's folklore, told around campfires and in schoolrooms. But the real legacy was in the quiet transformation of how people lived with the land and with each other. The railroad tracks that curved through the mountains now seemed less like scars on the landscape and more like the threads of a complex tapestry, weaving together the dreams and destinies of all who called this territory home.